Welcome to Sex, Violence, and Other Dementia-Related Surprises. This module contains lots of videos describing a variety of behaviors exhibited by people who have Alzheimer's and other dementia-related diseases.
When I first started telling this story about my dad asking my mother to contact an old girlfriend to arrange a sex date for him, I thought the takeaway lesson was finding humor in absurd situations.
We thought it was really strange and a little funny, but there were a lot of things we didn't know then.
True. In this particular case, we didn't know that inappropriate sexual behavior is not at all unusual in people who have stroke-related dementia or Alzheimer's. It's also been known to occur in people who are taking certain medications for Parkinson's.
It's unfortunate when people don't associate the behavior with a disease. That's why this section on sex, dementia, and humor can be so important. It's also very funny. So if you're dealing with someone who is exhibiting surprising or inappropriate sexual behavior, watch the video, then read Elaine's article, Dad Did What?, to learn more about the root causes and some helpful ways of dealing with it.
I would like to ask all of you to help me conduct a little informal survey about sex. Would you be willing to do that? Oh, good. Thank you so much. Okay, so what I'd like for you to do is just clear your minds. Just wipe that slate clean. Got it? And now I would like for you to visualize your parents having sex. Oh, it's uncomfortable, isn't it? Okay, so how much worse would it be if I asked you to visualize your grandparents having sex? Oh yeah, I know that's really weird. Okay, that's enough of that. But the good news, or the bad news, depending on your perspective, is that we are born as sexual beings and we die as sexual beings. And even diseases as debilitating as dementia cannot extinguish that flame within each of us. Case in point, on October 30th, 1993, my dad, who appeared to be as healthy and robust as any 75-year-old man on the planet, had a stroke. The next day, he was diagnosed with prostate cancer. And my mother, who was in terrible health herself, became his full-time caregiver. My parents lived on a farm 6 miles northwest of McPherson, Kansas, a town of about 14,000 people. And so in order to manage her stress and her loneliness and isolation, my mother had to develop some unique coping strategies. And one of the things that she did frequently was go to her computer, disengage her emotional monitor, and she would write to me about everything she was experiencing and exactly how she felt about it. So, I got a letter about 4 years after my dad started wearing adult diapers. And I was a little surprised by this letter. And I imagine that the day she wrote it, she had probably just finished washing her dishes, and without even taking off her apron, she went to the computer to write. And this is what she said. Dear Elaine, don't know if I've told you about Quentin's recent obsession with sex. Just out of the blue, one morning at breakfast, he turned to me and he said, Madeline, it occurs to me that you don't want to have sex with me anymore. And I said, that's right, Quentin, that part of our life is over. And then he said, well, if you're not willing to have sex with me, would it be okay with you if I had sex with somebody else? And I said, you know what? Knock yourself out. Just go for it. I figured if he could find someone who was willing to have sex with him, she could have all of him. She could deal with his wet depends. She could change his wet sheets in the middle of the night. She could pick him up off of the floor when he fell, and she could just have him all to herself. Good grief. Well, the next morning at breakfast, he turned to me and he said, Madeline, would you call Avis for me? Avis is not the car rental company. Avis is a girl that he took to his high school senior prom 60 years ago. Well, of course I didn't want to call Avis, but all day long, that was all he could talk about. He just followed me from room to room saying, have you called Avis? When are you going to call Avis? Why haven't you called Avis? When are you going to call Avis? Well, finally, I couldn't take it anymore. So I went to the phone and I picked it up and I called Avis. I didn't tell her why Quentin wanted to see her. But it turns out they live in Wichita, and she and her husband were coming to McPherson for a funeral on Saturday. So I said, well, why don't we meet at the Red Coach Inn for lunch? And so we agreed. So when Avis came walking into the restaurant, she had her oxygen bottle strapped to her walker. And I thought, well, that'll take care of that. So we sat down, we had a nice lunch. I told Avis's husband all of the things I was doing to make it easier to take care of Quentin, like the plastic pad that I put underneath his chair at the dining room table to make it easier for him to scoot up to and away from the table. And I told him about the ceiling hoist that we had installed above the bed, so it made it easier for me to lift him up to and out of bed. And he told me about all the things he was doing to make it easier to take care of Avis. And so we had a nice lunch and a good time, and we got in the car to go home, and I turned to Quentin and I said, so, what do you think of Avis now? And he said, I think she wants me. So this situation went on for months. Every 10 days, 2 weeks, I'd get another letter, and there would be a couple of sentences or a paragraph in there about the folks getting together with Avis and her husband. And honestly, at the time, I thought it was rather amusing. Until one day I opened up one of her letters, and my husband Alex was sitting over at the breakfast table reading the paper, and I was reading the letter, and I said, listen to this. She said, speaking of jobs, which we weren't, I need for you to do something when you come home next week. I need for you to have the sex talk with your father. I thought, oh, no. This is not a conversation I wanted to have with my dad. But my brothers were mad at him. My sisters-in-law were disgusted. And my mother was exasperated, and so it fell to me. So we flew home to Kansas. I got Dad in the pickup. We went out for a drive to look at the crops. And as he was looking wistfully out the window at a farmer driving his tractor in the field, I said, Dad, I'm sorry you can't farm anymore. I know you really miss that. And he said, I do, but that's not the worst part. And I said, really? What is? And he said, it's your mother. She's cut me off. And I thought, oh boy, here we go. So I took a deep breath, I pulled off to the side of the road, I switched off the ignition, and I said, Dad, the reason you can't farm anymore is the same reason you can't have sex. It's the stroke and it's the prostate cancer. And I said, you know what? You're not being nice to Mom. She's working so hard to take care of you, and this just isn't respectful. And I said, and you know what? It takes a certain amount of physical dexterity to have sex, and you don't have it. And you're a big man, and she's a little woman, and you could hurt her. And I said, and besides that, you haven't even thought about the logistics, for crying out loud. Mom would have to drive her to a hotel. Avis's husband would have to drive her to the hotel. And then what the heck are those two going to do while you're in there trying to have sex? I mean, seriously, do you think Mom's going to put the ceiling hoist in her purse and come into the room and help you out? No! He said, stop it! Okay. I did not handle it well. I tried, but there were several things we didn't know at that point. Starting with the fact that you can never, ever win an argument with a person who has dementia. The second thing we didn't know, and I'm really sorry we didn't know this at the time, is that surprising and inappropriate sexual behavior is not at all unusual in people who are stroke survivors, individuals who have Alzheimer's, or people who are taking dopamine to control the symptoms of Parkinson's. Poor Doris learned this the hard way one day when she opened up her cable bill, and she looked at the total and she was aghast. And she ran to the phone, she picked it up, and she called the cable company, and she said, "There has been a terrible mistake." She said, "You have billed us for $700 of porn, and we don't watch those kinds of movies in this house." And the cable man was very kind and calm, and he put her on hold, and when he came back, he said, "Ma'am, I'm really sorry." He said, "But someone is watching those movies at your house every morning between 2 a.m. and 5 a.m. Well, she was furious until she learned that the dopamine that he was taking to control his shaking had actually destroyed the pleasure trigger monitor in his brain. She was still mad, but now she was mad at the doctor for not letting them know that this was a possible side effect, and she was no longer angry with her husband. And then there's Sadie, dear, sweet, wonderful 90-year-old Sadie, who lives in a memory care facility in Woodburn, Oregon. And the staff loves Sadie because she's just easy. She's happy. She loves to sit in the reception area and just greet people all day long as they come and go. Never causes a problem for anyone. Until one afternoon, a very handsome, buff UPS delivery driver came in, and evidently his muscles were bulging underneath the weight of his load. And Sadie looked up at him and she said, "Would you like to see me dance?" And he said, "Sure, sweetie, I'd love to see you dance." Well, imagine everybody's surprise when Sadie ripped off her sweater, pulled open her blouse, and started to gyrate and dance the way only a 90-year-old woman can. So as the aide assisted Sadie with her clothes and helped her back to her room, the administrator called Sadie's daughter, and she told her what happened. And Sadie's daughter said, "My mother would never do such a thing. She is a good Christian woman." And the administrator said, "Well, you know, I'm pretty sure her faith had nothing to do with that dance." We didn't know any of this 15 years ago. But my mother, bless her heart, after I botched the sex talk with my dad, decided that she would just sit down with him and have a rational, reasonable conversation about sex. And she said about 10 minutes into it, she came to the realization that he was just not playing with a full deck. So she decided to just have a little fun with the story. She went to the phone, she picked it up, she called Avis, and she said, "Avis, guess why we've been calling you so often? Guess why Quentin really wants to see you?" And Avis's response was, "Really?" She was actually quite flattered. And she had a great deal of fun going to the beauty shop her cousin owned and telling all of her girlfriends about her amorous boyfriend in McPherson. Avis's husband said, "Really?" But who knows? Maybe he looked at her a little differently, knowing that there was another man who found her absolutely irresistible. I think the remarkable thing about this is that my mother did not know the science behind the damage that had occurred in my dad's brain, but she did know him. And so she decided that she would just focus on the humor of the situation, and she chose not to be jealous, angry, or hurt. And several months later, I got another letter, and Mom said that they had had yet another lunch with Avis and her husband, and on the way home, Dad turned to her and said, "I'm glad I didn't marry Avis." And Mom said, "Oh, really?" She said, "Why's that?" And he said, "Didn't you see her teeth? Our kids would have looked like chipmunks." And that was the end of the affair. And he went back to being the loving, faithful husband that he had always been. Understanding the sexual practices and preferences of people with healthy brains can be confounding. But when we see something that we think is odd or inappropriate in our parents or our grandparents, it can really be unsettling. Consider Diane, a woman about my age. And Diane's mother's Alzheimer's had advanced to the point that she could no longer stay at home by herself, and her husband could no longer take care of her. So Diane went home to help them move into a long-term care facility. And when she was packing up the medicine cabinet, she found a bottle of Viagra. She picked it up, and she walked out, and she found her dad, and she said, "Really, Dad? Viagra? Really?" And he said, "She may not remember my name, but when I put my arms around her and I kiss her, she never forgets what comes next." And he said, "It's the one thing that keeps us connected. It relaxes her and it makes her happy. And if that makes you uncomfortable, get over it." Then he took the pills and he shoved them into his pocket. There are a lot of practical strategies that can be employed to help cope with what we might think is surprising or inappropriate sexual behavior in older people and people with dementia. But I think the place to start is with understanding that we never, never outlive our sexuality. And to me, I think that's pretty good news, because as all of us age, I think it's a little reassuring to know that we may have something more to look forward to than mealtime and bingo.